In very simple terms, the airbrush is simply a pen that sprays paint. All airbrushes, no matter what make or model or design, require air. Air comes from a compressor and then gets to the bottom of the airbrush by means of an air hose. This is an adapter that you can use depending on what kind of air hose you have. The hose then attaches to the bottom of the airbrush and you're ready. Now this particular model is the Patriot from Badger. This is a gravity feed airbrush. That means that you put paint in the top cup here, and gravity and the air source obviously helps it to get through the front of the airbrush. Now this Patriot is classed as a double action. So what that means is pressing this trigger down allows air to come out the front. Pressing it down and pulling it back draws paint down from the paint cup and out through the front of the airbrush. So that's a double action airbrush, and which is probably the most common airbrush you'll encounter. This is the other type of airbrush you'll encounter. This is a single action airbrush, but this is also bottle feed. You can get double action bottle feed airbrushes, but this is the single action variety. This is the model 200 by Badger. Exactly the same as far as connecting to your compressor at the bottom here, but this time we use a paint jar which simply plugs into the bottom of the airbrush, and you've got a far greater amount of paint to use for perhaps larger projects. Now to get the paint to come out the front of this airbrush, you simply press this button. There's no pulling back at all. Now to adjust the volume of paint that comes out the front of the airbrush, there's an adjuster screw here. So you can't actually adjust this while you're airbrushing like a double action. Depending on what you intend to use your airbrush for, a double action or a single action may be more appropriate. All airbrushes are capable of spraying thin or thick lines. Depending on what model you get, some are better at producing a really fine line than others, but in general, especially with the double action airbrushes, it's all to do with the distance from the surface. The spray pattern from an airbrush is a round spray pattern. It's not a fan spray pattern like a spray gun. So the closer you get to the surface, the paint hasn't had a chance to spread out, so you'll get a pencil line. Moving further away from the surface, it has spread out and you'll get a much wider coverage. So if you're doing a background, you'll want to be quite a bit further away from the surface, possibly 6 inches or so. Doing really fine work, you can be as close as a millimetre away from the surface, and that will give you a pencil line. Again, as I said, depends on the type of airbrush you use, because it does ultimately, when you're talking about really fine work, depends on the size of the needle and the nozzle at the front. So with the correct airbrush and properly thin paint, you can just about everything. Now with a single action airbrush, you are limited to a certain extent, because as soon as you press this down, paint comes out. So these aren't really suitable for fine work, but for stenciling, modelling, anything that you need to paint sort of a larger area, absolutely fine. For detail work, you've got to go with a double action. Okay, here we've got the front of the airbrush. You can see the needle protruding from the nozzle. Now what happens is, pressing down for air will purely allow air to come through the airbrush because you're still blocking off the nozzle. Pressing down and pulling back, you can see the needle withdrawing. And when I do that, it allows paint to come through the front of the airbrush. Now, depending on how far I pull this back, it will allow a different amount of paint through. That's how you control the volume of paint and how fine your spray pattern is, together with the distance from the surface. Airbrushes are suitable for just about any kind of paint. The only exception is oil paint, because oil paint is too thick to actually go through an airbrush. You do need a relatively thin paint for airbrushing, but you can use water-based or solvent-based. Solvent-based is exactly the same kind of paint that was used to paint a car in a factory. So this is Spectratex. This is a paint from Badger. This is water-based. A lot of paints these days are suitable for different surfaces, such as canvas or clothing. This is one such paint. This is good for t-shirt art and fine art, that kind of thing. All water-based paints are non-toxic. You should really wear something like a dust mask or something when you're airbrushing, just so that you don't inhale any of the paint. Even though it's not toxic, over time you don't really want to be breathing anything in like paint anyway. So that's all you need. It doesn't smell. It's safe, and it is the most versatile of paints. You can also use watercolours if you're a watercolour artist, or you can use body paint. These are all very safe. There are no toxic chemicals in any of these paints. The only paint you need to watch out for is the solvent based. You should wear the appropriate mask and have proper ventilation. How much you want to spend on a airbrush is entirely up to you, really. It's a little bit like saying how much is a car. You can get airbrushes that are good for sort of all-round work. You can get airbrushes that are specifically used for very, very fine art. It just depends what you want to use it for. There's an airbrush for every budget. Some are cheaper than others. But it's entirely up to you. Then of course you've got the compressor to think about. Compressors vary in price. What I've found is that a very expensive compressor will be a very quiet one. That seems to be the sort of rule of thumb. You can get very cheap compressors from DIY stores. The very cheap ones are very loud. So depending on where you decide to airbrush, you may airbrush in your garage, you may actually have a body shop place that you can airbrush in, or you may even be airbrushing in a spare room in your house. That compressor noise is a factor, even though you probably won't even think about it at the moment. You've got to think about your neighbours, obviously. Perhaps you might be airbrushing in the middle of the night. You really don't want one of those things kicking in at 3 in the morning, because you will jump out of your skin. So the compressor is a factor, and I would recommend paying out a little bit more on a quiet model. Size also with a compressor. Some compressors have a large air tank on them, which means you can spray for longer before the compressor actually starts to run again. That really is only applicable if you're running quite a few airbrushes. You'll see a lot of t-shirt artists with about 30 airbrushes with different colour paints plugged in. I'm pretty sure you won't go that far to begin with. So if you get your first airbrush, I recommend spraying a little bit of money on a quieter airbrush, and that'll probably last you, to be honest. As I said, paint is a factor depending on what you want to paint. It's up to you what you use, but paint does go a very, very long way. Especially if you use a gravity feed, you can get away with a couple of drops of paint at a time. So a bottle of paint could last you a really long time if you're using it on small stuff. So it is, once you've got the equipment, once you've paid out for your airbrush and your compressor, and you've got a few bottles of paint, you're ready to go for quite some time, I would say, for the hobby airbrusher. So it's once you've splashed out on the equipment, it's a very, very cheap hobby. What you use the airbrush for is obviously entirely up to you. You probably will start doing stuff like simple stencil work. Even that looks really good with an airbrush. You can get very nice fades, three-dimensional effects just with a stencil. And I'm pretty sure once you've picked an airbrush up, you'll start moving on to things like t-shirts, jackets, even baseball boots, things like that. And then when you build your confidence up on a surface that actually lets the paint sink in, you can paint things like motorcycle tanks, motorcycle helmets. If you've got the room, you can go onto cars. You can use it for scale modelling, radio controlled helicopters, cake decorating with the correct paint, fingernail art, body art. It's entirely up to you, and there really is no limit as to what you can paint. So if you do fancy having a go at airbrushing, I suggest you go on a course and you'll just get to grips with learning the basics, and then you can move on from there.